The curriculum of dawn. Mara had always thought of school as a place where answers were given, not discovered. Classrooms were rows of neatly aligned desks where the day's problems arrived in tidy parcels, a chapter to read, a formula to memorize, a set of dates to place in chronological order. She had been good at that kind of schooling, precise, punctual, polished with the sheen of correct answers. But when she turned 17 and transferred to the old academy on the hill, the world of certainties she carried began to loosen at the edges. The academy's headmaster, a quiet woman named Professor Ives, did not hand out answers. She asked questions so wide they felt like doors. How do you know what you know? What counts as truth in a noisy city full of competing stories? Her lectures took the shape of conversations that bridged philosophy, science, art, and the ordinary craft of living. It was in one such conversation that Mara heard, for the first time, the phrase that would follow her for months: accepting truth is not a passive appointment with reality. It is an act that requires a full-bodied readiness and eagerness, a discipline, a kind of bright attention. Mara thought about that statement as she walked home through the city at dusk. She had interpreted being ready as a matter of receiving, keeping her notebooks open, letting information pour in. But Professor Ives's words suggested something else. Truth, she realized, wanted a response. It wanted to be approached with energy. The Academy's syllabus reflected that conviction. One course, called Inquiry Practicum, asked students to spend a month living inside the dilemmas they studied. They interviewed people whose lives complicated textbook verdicts. They tested assumptions, not only of science, but of ordinary moral practice. They treated their own certainties as objects of study. Mara's project was simple in description and complex in execution: investigate the truth of failure. In the school's neat logic, failure was a temporary state on the path to eventual success, a learning step in a predetermined descent. In the city, failure was messier. It could be public, humiliating, and permanently altering. Mara wanted to know whether failure, in itself, held any truth about who a person was or could be. She began by speaking to people who had failed at things they had believed would define them: an entrepreneur who had watched his startup dissolve after a data breach, a violinist who lost the use of a finger for a season, a local activist whose campaign had stalled without raising the funds needed to succeed. What surprised Mara was not that all these people felt pain, but that most of them described a moment, a shift in posture, when truth arrived. It was not the truth of "you failed" as a conclusive sentence, but an invitation to reassess assumptions. What did you value? What did you think failure meant? What were you willing to change? Mara kept a journal. She recorded their stories and then, with the same rigorous curiosity, charted her own reactions. When someone described disappointment, she noted the words and then asked, what does this disappointment reveal about prevailing narratives, about merit, luck, fairness? When an entrepreneur told her he had believed in an invincible plan, Mara didn't stop at pity. She probed the pattern that had led to arrogance, the cognitive traps of confirmation bias, the social pressures that rewarded bold claims. She asked for names, dates, and documents, not because she wanted to catch anyone out, but because truth demanded texture. It was when she interviewed Mr. Halvorsen, a retired schoolteacher who taught geometry at the community center, that Mara felt the question of attitude crystallize. Mr. Halvorsen greeted her with a smile and a thermos of coffee. He had a habit of asking a simple question before answering anything: and what's the spirit in your head today? Mara blinked. The spirit in my head? Yes, he said. If the truth's message were a visitor, would you let it in? Are you alert or flat? Curious or defensive? I've seen talented minds turned small by a fear of things that don't fit their script. To learn truth, they must first prime themselves with a lively posture, open hands, steady breath, and the willingness to be corrected. He told her a story about his failing first term as a teacher. He had assumed his students were uninterested because they didn't speak up. He blamed them and doubled down. It took a student's private note, "I can't ask because I'm afraid of being wrong," to make him change. He began to ask not for answers, but for attempts. He invited the mistakes to the front of the room as objects of curiosity. The classroom became noisier, messier, and more truthful. "That's the education of truth," he said. "It asks not that you be unshakable, but that you be animated enough to learn." Mara's experiments with recall and correction followed. In the math club, she stopped silently correcting her peers' misconceptions and instead modeled the thought process. "What if we check X here? X. Let's try the alternate step and see." In debate, she replaced rhetorical victory with the practice of rephrasing an opponent's strongest point until both of them agreed it had been fairly represented. The results were subtle but cumulative: less defensiveness, more attentive listening, and a growing sense that truth was a practice shared among people, not a trophy to be taken. But living with a spirited attitude had costs. It required admitting errors publicly and sitting with the discomfort of being wrong. Old friends, who had admired Mara's quiet confidence, found her newly public missteps unsettling. Teachers who preferred neat records misread the exploratory approach as sloppiness. The city, always eager for clean narratives, was impatient with ongoing ambiguities. In those moments, she returned to an exercise Professor Ives had taught them: the mirror question. When confronted with a claim, ask first if this is true. What changes for me? Then ask if this is false. What changes for me? The point was to reveal where your own interests or anxieties might be coloring your appraisal of the claim. The exercise was less about cynicism and more about clarity. It trained Mara to recognize the emotional gravity that sometimes anchored people to certain beliefs and to disentangle the belief from the person holding it. Gradually, Mara learned to carry the attitude of spirited readiness as a companion rather than a posture. She wasn't always bright-eyed. Some mornings she woke heavy with fatigue. Her curiosity damped. But even then she attempted small acts of openness, a question toward a classmate, a willingness to pause before reacting, a note in her journal that captured what she didn't understand instead of covering it up. These small acts multiplied into habits. The culminating project for Inquiry Practicum was a community symposium. Each student presented their work, but the format was unusual. Instead of polished reports, they staged experiments of listening. The symposium had booths where attendees could present a belief and invite others to test it through conversation, live fact-checking, and role-play. Mara's station was titled Failure, Evidence, and Possibility. People came with hardened stories and left with something thinner, more breathable, a sense that a single setback did not complete the portrait of a life. That night, as the city lights pooled like scattered coins, Professor Ives found Mara packing up her notes. "You look different," she said. "Less like someone who stores facts and more like someone who tends them." Mara smiled, thinking of Mr. Halvorson's thermos and the entrepreneur's honest recounting and the violinist's season of silence. "I think," she said, "truth asked me to show up, not just with notebooks, but with energy. To accept truth is to be awake to correction and invitation." Professor Ives nodded. "And to make that a habit is the most practical form of courage I know." Years later, Mara would still find herself returning to that vocabulary whenever she felt the urge to retreat into certainty. She would remind younger colleagues that the classroom is a laboratory not only for knowledge, but for character, that the readiness to be corrected and the capacity to persist after failure are twin muscles that must be exercised. She would insist that the point of education was not to graduate with a perfect transcript, but to graduate with an appetite for truth, a posture of animated attention, and the humility to say, when necessary, "I got that wrong, teach me." The academy did not produce saints or sages. It produced people who had practiced being awake. Mara's life, like the life of any well-tended garden, remained a mix of harvests and winters. But she moved through it with a clearer compass, an ethic that fused curiosity with courage, and a conviction that the most valuable thing school could teach was not which answers to accept, but how to accept them with spirit, with rigor, and with a resilient willingness to learn again.